Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us in this wonderful conversation we're going to have. I'm so excited. My name is Ana Julia Hatar. I am the president of the Venezuelan American Association of the US, and I am delighted to be here tonight to welcome José Miguel Vivanco in a conversation with Marcia Briggs, sorry. And I have to say, for those who don't know the organization, that this VOWS has been in the market for 80 years. This is an organization that was created to promote relations between Venezuela and the US, and specifically business and trade relations, but given the humanitarian crisis and the political crisis in Venezuela, when I took the presidency of the organization, it was decided with the board of directors that we would be like a platform to give voice to the real problems and dramas that the Venezuelan people are going through these years. So I am going to begin by welcoming Jose Miguel Vivanco. Jose Miguel Vivanco has been for many years, an unconditional friend of Venezuela and for those who have been fighting for the return of democracy to our country. Jose Miguel Vivanco is that person that you can call at 1 o'clock in the morning if you know that your brother, your father, your sister, your son have been taken by the military police. That's Jose Miguel Vivanco. I'll read his CV later, but that's what he is for Venezuelans. And I am very proud also to have Marcia with us today. Marcia is also a fighter for human rights in the world. And she was in Venezuela in January this year. It was like undercover. She, she even went into hospitals and filmed. And she was there when Guaido jumped the fence to get into Congress. So she doesn't only know um, like the rhetoric of the drama of Venezuela, she's been there in very dramatic times. So now I'm going to read your CVs. Jose Miguel Vivanco, Director of Human Rights Watch, of Human Rights Watch American Division, is general expert on Latin America. Before joining, she was an attorney for the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights at the Organization of American States. He founded the Center for Justice and International Law, an NGO that files complaints before international human rights bodies. Mr. Vivanco has also been an adjunct professor of law at Georgetown University Law Center and the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University. He has published many important books, and he has been, I mean, he travels to Latin America, and he obviously gives his opinion to main media issues. Let me see here, how can I get to, oh, here we go. And Marcia Biggs is a freelance journalist focusing on international conflict and humanitarian crisis. She contributes regularly to PBS NewsHour, which I listen all the time, for whom she recently reported from Venezuela as its refugees crisis becomes one of the world's most dire. With over a decade in the Middle East, her work has highlighted the targeting of doctors in the Syrian civil war, the use of children in armed conflict, as well as various stages of the battle for Mosul and the plight of Yazidi girls who have escaped ISIS captivity. In 2018, she became one of the few television journalists to travel to Yemen, producing a 4-part series for PBS. A pivot to Latin America in 2019 took her to Honduras, ground zero of the Central American migration crisis. So, I mean, thank you, both of you, for being here. Thank you, José Miguel. Thank you in the name of all Venezuelans. Thank you, Marcia, for being here. And please, Marcia, take the floor. I'm sure this is going to be a fantastic and very learning conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for those very kind remarks. And I'm very uncomfortable when you read my CV. Thank you for everything you said. So, José Miguel, I'm very happy to talk to you because we actually spoke on the phone long ago when I was doing a piece on Honduras for PBS. So this is kind of coming full circle for me. So I'm very happy. We don't have a ton of time, so I want to just sort of jump right in.
Sure.
I want to talk about the humanitarian crisis first. When I was in Venezuela 10 months ago, I guess, yeah, January, the humanitarian crisis had forced over 4 million people to flee. It was one of the world's worst refugee crises outside of a war zone. And then several months ago with COVID, it seemed to create a refugee crisis in reverse, with people being evicted from their homes in neighboring countries. So I wanted to know, what is the status today of the refugee crisis or the migrant crisis? And what is the most dire issue of human rights at the borders for refugees and returnees?
Well, thanks a lot. Thank you very much, Ana Julia, and thank you, Marcia, for having me at this, exchange of or interview or conversation. Let's say conversation on Venezuela. The humanitarian crisis of Venezuela is a real emergency. It's a real problem. We have done 2 reports jointly with Johns Hopkins University, with a group of doctors, medical doctors. And the latest one, the one that we released this year, was dedicated to examine the issue of water, access to water, potable water, what was the capacity of Venezuelans hospitals to handle water. And the conclusions of that report are really devastating, to the point that 20% of public hospitals in Venezuela, they have virtually no access to water. And the doctors, as well as the patients, have to bring their own water if they are going to be admitted. They use, for instance, any option, for instance, water coming from the air conditioner window units, and those, if there is a leak there, they keep that one usually to, and they reuse that water, for instance, for the toilet system in the hospitals. And around 65-68% of public hospitals have irregular, inconsistent access to water, given the shortages of electricity across the country. Our colleagues from Johns Hopkins University have described conditions, humanitarian conditions in Venezuela in terms of medicine and food, as typical for them of a country in war, like those ones in Africa. This group of doctors have done similar research in the Middle East, in Yemen, in Syria, and in conflicts, war zones in Africa. And their evaluation, their assessment is that the shortages of vaccine and basic stuff that you use in any hospital is similar to countries at war. There is no question in our mind, based on our own research, that the humanitarian emergency of Venezuela is one of the main reasons of this massive exodus of Venezuelans toward the rest of the region. We are looking at this stage, at this point, to over 5 million Venezuelans distributed, mostly, at least 2 million and more than 2 million of them in Colombia. But you could find large communities of Venezuelans in Argentina, in Brazil, in Chile, Peru, and Ecuador as well. And recently, during this pandemic, there have been a group of Venezuelans, especially those ones that have been living in Colombia, working in the informal sector of the economy, without much, access to health and food. And those ones have been forced to return to Venezuela, especially in cases where they have relatives in Venezuela that they feel like they have a chance to help them and to take care of them. Unfortunately, this group of Venezuelans who have returned to Venezuela, which is not much, it's around 130,000. That is approximately the number. 140 at this stage is 145,000 Venezuelans who have been forced to return to Venezuela. Most of them are subject of mistreatment in Venezuela. They are treated as traitors, and they are subject of quarantine that is way, way beyond the 14 days. And the conditions of the essentially arbitrary detention for them in confinements, locations improvised by the government of Venezuela are so basic, again, with very poor access to water and overcrowding conditions, that there are many, many cases of Venezuelans that were not contaminated with the COVID that have been unfortunately infested with COVID in those locations at the border. We have made some proposals to governments in the region, mostly the Lima group, for instance, to try to negotiate a deal through United Nations, according to which those Venezuelans at the border, especially the border with Colombia, let's say based in Cucuta, who are planning to go to Venezuela to visit their relatives or temporary return or whatever, they should be subject of the same protocol with regard to COVID managed by for instance, the Pan American Health Organization. So they are tested on the side of Colombia, and if they don't have any sign of COVID, they should be able to enter into Venezuela, and that test that was administered in Colombia should be valid for Venezuela. So they are not subject of an additional treatment and in confinement for another month or 2 or 3 in those in similar conditions to those ones who have returned up to date. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to get enough countries and governments supporting this type of initiative. That obviously will require some heavy persuasion from the regional governments with support of the United Nations to convince the Maduro government to implement a uniform mechanism at the border, so we could eliminate this mistreatment of Venezuelans returning to Venezuela.
And from what I understand, the testing isn't even accurate. There's only a few labs that process the PCR test even in the entire country.
It's highly inaccurate, Marcia. It's highly inaccurate. They're using cheap mechanisms that are very unreliable. on the Venezuela side. So, but I mean, the way that the government of Venezuela is handling the return of these Venezuelans, which again we are looking into not even 150,000, is not consistent with basic health standards.
So do you think that it's just collective punishment being rationalized via the pandemic?
Look, it's hard to say. I think it's lack of interest. I mean, lack of attention. They politically, apparently, they have concluded that it's profitable for them to treat these Venezuelans, for the rest of the community, the rest of Venezuelans, to present them as traitors, as actually sort of toxic people who could carry the virus with them. So they treat them as a pariahs. I mean, we are looking into a dictatorship that essentially what it does is to calculate politically whatever policy or action that could be considered potentially profitable for them, and they implement that one without any kind of accountability or any kind of control.
We talked to one kid who had come across and was put into a school with 500 or so other people, and just practically on top of each other. He had to share a bed with another person. But what's interesting is that it was very difficult for us to actually get anyone to talk about that because of the fear. I mean, he spoke to a lot of people, but no one who would actually speak to us on camera. So he was very brave to do so. Speaking of fear, when I was there in January, I did a piece on the crumbling medical sector, and you talk about not having access to water. I interviewed a group of ladies who were getting chemo treatments, and they had brought all their medicine. They had brought all the plastic tubing. They brought gowns to put on. They had even brought water, as you mentioned, and one even brought a cup to go to the bathroom in, because these were not only not functioning, but they were so disgusting that these women were afraid that they would get an infection.
That's right.
So it's just shocking. But so I was in regular contact with a myriad of doctors in Venezuela, some of whom I quoted in my piece on the record, and others who were just speaking to me on background. And we were in regular contact. And when COVID hit, and I wanted to do a story on how Venezuela was affected by COVID, it was like radio silence. Nobody would respond to my messages. Nobody would talk to me. And to me, this felt like fear. Human Rights Watch did a report on, well, first of all, tell me what happens to people who talk about COVID in their areas.
Well, they are subject of harassment, persecution. There are doctors, our doctors, when I say our, I'm not referring to Human Rights Watch. We have our joint venture with Johns Hopkins has been incredibly helpful and effective, because these are doctors who use the same language as Venezuelan doctors. So they talk to each other, they know what they're talking about, and we have been able to develop a very impressive and large network of doctors, Venezuelan doctors, who are in direct and constant communication with the group of doctors from Johns Hopkins. And they are very careful. They have to be, because there are no remedies in Venezuela. I mean, if you are fully exposed to any kind of retaliation, there are doctors who have been courageous enough to publicly complain about conditions, as well as the manipulation of numbers by the government, the official numbers of COVID in Venezuela. And those doctors have been detained by the security service. Fortunately, thanks to the international pressure and attention, a scandal provoked by those detentions. The detentions have been short-term detentions, hours, few days. No due process, forget it. I mean, there is no chance for any kind of procedure. This is just the quintessential exercise of arbitrary detentions and harassment to impose the views of the government based on fear, retaliation against doctors as well as nurses. And so there is a very tight control over information coming out of public as well as private hospitals in Venezuela.
You talk about, arbitrary detention and crackdown. I mean, these things are not new in Venezuela. We've seen a lot of that in the last few years. And when I was there, we heard about, difficult situations during the protests, violent crackdown, and some incredible stories of extrajudicial killings by FAES, by the Special Action Forces. Human Rights Watch issued a report at the end of August, which referred to Venezuela as a police state lashing out amid COVID-19. And you were quoted as saying, you can't even share a private message criticizing the Maduro government via WhatsApp without fear of being prosecuted. So tell me about how COVID is being used, not just as a way to silence doctors, but in general in society.
COVID has been like a perfect storm used by Maduro and his thugs to strengthening control over the population. Before the pandemic, you were able to see some sort of public demonstrations, mobilization by the opposition, civil society. But with the pandemic on top of all of us, this has been a perfect excuse for the government to strengthening draconian mechanisms and rules to exercise control in popular areas, in rural areas. They have checkpoints in between different departments or provinces in Venezuela. So if you are lucky enough to have gasoline, to travel from one location to another one, you might it will be very unlikely that you are not going to be stopped by a checkpoint by the military or the police doing some sort of routine control. And so unfortunately, conditions even in popular areas where the colectivos, these delinquents who are entitled to carry weapons and to use those weapons and to torture somebody, to kill with impunity. They have license for that. They have license for detention and to work together with the Bolivarian Guard or SEBIN according to the needs of the government. They are pretty much in control, and the risk of when you cross the line are huge. I mean, there is one interesting report that was issued by Michelle Bachelet, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, that was pretty much consistent with our information, that detail techniques of torture by security forces recently implemented by the government of Maduro. And the techniques include electricity in the genitals, and electricity in the eyes, and electricity, suffocation, by the security forces with plastic bags under the water of those under detention. And if you look at carefully those techniques documented by the High Commissioner for Human Rights are pretty similar to the same type of torture implemented by Pinochet in Chile and other type of similar dictatorships in Latin America. We have documented in Venezuela the use of military tribunals in military stations with no due process of over 850 civilians prosecuted in military stations. We have done this together with Foro Penal. Foro Penal is one of the most impressive, really, organizations of association in civil society, associations of lawyers representing victims of human rights abuses. 850 civilians prosecuted with no due process in military installation by military tribunals, is again something that you could expect from Pinochet or from Videla, the military junta in Argentina, but not today. That was during the Cold War, different type of times, 40 years ago, but not in the 21st century in Latin America.
So you mentioned the Bachelet report. You mentioned a few other reports. There's a Lima Group fact-finding mission. There's fact-finding mission by the UN. The ICC called it crimes against humanity. Where do we go from here? You have all these reports documenting these things. So is there any body that is has the power to stand up for the human rights of the Venezuelan people?
Well, the good news is that most, I would say actually, let me rephrase this one. All the international machinery that has been designed has been created, established to a regional level as well as the universal level to document human rights abuses anywhere in the world are very active on Venezuela. So Venezuela is getting sufficient, enough, adequate attention from the international community. And I'm very careful with what I'm saying because for Venezuelans, it's not good enough. And it's perfectly reasonable to understand that people say, but another report. Well, that is what we have. We have an international machinery that's been created to highlight, to examine, to document, and to denounce, to the world when they have evidence of human rights abuses. But at the Human Rights Council, Venezuela has two permanent mechanisms of supervision, human rights supervision. One is the Office of the High Commissioner, and the other one is this fact-finding panel of 3 experts who released a report recently where they were able to establish that they have found evidence of crimes against humanity in Venezuela. It's the first time that we have an international body under the sponsorship of United Nations that is able to establish a pattern of crimes against humanity. And they even went as far as to argue that, according to them, there is enough evidence that Maduro himself, as well as Diosdado Cabello and the Home Minister and Defense Ministers, are very much aware of these atrocities. This is critically important because simultaneously, the ICC, the International Criminal Court, has a preliminary investigation open in the case of for the case of Venezuela, and my sense is that they are moving forward in the right direction, and keep in mind that the International Criminal Court has jurisdiction to judge not only crimes against humanity and war crimes. They are able to establish personal responsibility. Personal means the criminal responsibility of those ones who are running Venezuela today, who are in charge of the country. So it's not like another UN body who will pass a resolution condemning the government of Venezuela for their atrocities. It's something very specific where eventually the ICC has jurisdiction to establish if or whether Maduro himself, as well as the rest of the government officials, are either or not responsible for massive atrocities. And that means personal liability for them. So this is what we have. And I think it's fair to acknowledge that the whole machinery is very much active in the case of Venezuela.
What's the timeline for that with the ICC? I'm kind of trying to understand what's the next step that those who are interested in this topic is sort of waiting for?
No timeline. What is the deadline? No deadline. Let me give you an example. Colombia has been under similar scrutiny by the ICC. There are only 2 countries in the region that are under direct scrutiny by the ICC, Colombia and Venezuela. But for how long Colombia has been under observation by the ICC? 15 years? Now, I know that this is going to, for those ones who are watching this, are going to be very discouraged, and I will, say, my God, so, this tribunal is going to be maybe investigating conditions in Venezuela for another 10 years. Well, there is a big difference between Venezuela and Colombia. In Colombia, there is enough evidence of crimes against humanity and war crimes as well. But there is a big difference. In Colombia, you do have an independent judiciary, fully independent. It could be ineffective, but it's independent. So in Colombia, you have occasionally very rigorous and serious investigations by the local prosecutors as well as judges, and they're not following instructions from the executive branch. In Venezuela, you don't have that. In Venezuela, you have full concentration of power, and the Supreme Court, as well as the rest of the tribunals, are essentially an appendix of the executive branch. There's only one judge that I know that had the courage to challenge the government of Venezuela on a single case, implementing what United Nations was requesting with regard to an arbitrary detention. And that is the case of Judge Lourdes Afiuni. And Judge Lourdes Afiuni, have the dignity, the integrity of doing the right thing with regard to a single case. Well, Chavez was upset with that decision, and as a result, she went to prison, and she was abused in prison. She was subject of all sort of torture in prison for several years. She's still under criminal prosecution, in Venezuela for what she did, but it's only a single case. Now, why this is relevant? Because the International Criminal Court, if they're able to establish that there are crimes against humanity, and at the same time they conclude that the local government has control of the judiciary and there is no chance of justice at local level, they must take control of the case. And the current chief prosecutor of the ICC has repeatedly said that she will take decisions on Venezuela soon, and before her time expires as chief prosecutor. And she's going to be around as a chief prosecutor of the ICC only until June of next year. So we should be expecting some, formal and more kind of robust decision from the ICC before June of next year.
Okay. And then I have to open it up to questions, but I have one more question for you. I'm giving myself just a couple more minutes. Talking about the election, a lot of people I spoke with in Venezuela were very worried that President Trump would lose the election because of what they thought it might meant for the pressure that he's been putting on the Maduro regime. So how do you think a Biden presidency will affect the current relationship between both the Maduro regime and the opposition?
It's difficult to predict. What is a shame is the campaign orchestrated by some Venezuelans in Florida, as well as Cuban Americans and Colombians, to misinform the population in Florida about the alternative to Trump. In other words, what will represent the election of President Biden for the US. That type of misinformation delivered by this type of communities, and I'm not referring to all Venezuelans, I'm referring to some Venezuelans, by pretending or supporting the idea that Castro Chavismo will be running the White House if Biden wins the election. I think it's very unhelpful. It's not only because it's false, there is no basis for something like that, and at the same time, it creates a sense of sort of apocalyptic view of the new administration. I think what the new administration, the Biden administration, will do with the case, and I hope certainly that they will try. I'm not talking, I'm not a spokesperson for them, but I know many of those ones involved with the Obama-Biden administration, who most of them are going to be, again, running foreign policy for Latin America. What I hope is that they will continue pressing Venezuela for transition to democracy. And I think they're in better conditions given the credibility of Biden, unlike the Trump administration. The credibility of a Biden administration to build up a more consistent multilateral pressure on the government of Venezuela by developing a policy together with European allies and Latin American democracies to exercise pressure, not only in terms of pressing for transition to democracy and respect for fundamental rights, but also addressing the huge humanitarian emergency of Venezuela.
Okay, I'm going to open it up to questions, and we already have a couple in the Q&A queue. So I'll just start at the top. The first one, is that sentiment of presenting returnees as pariahs and toxic or contaminated people, almost subhuman, is that sentiment shared by the general population?
I don't think so, but certainly there is a segment of Venezuelan society who are being captured by the government, are easily manipulated by the government of Maduro, and this idea, which is similar to what happened in other countries, this xenophobia, this reaction to Venezuelans, for instance, in Ecuador, in Colombia, in Chile, the perception that these people may represent a threat for the local ones, and since the government has been trying to persuade the population that, given the isolation of Venezuela, the lack of business with the rest of the world, is in better conditions to handle, the pandemic, because there are no much traffic. Prior to the pandemic, prior to March, there were already, few airlines companies and business with the rest of the world. So that type of isolation benefited the population from potential contamination from outside Venezuela. So my sense is that they're going to, probably there is a segment of the population who are victims of this type of manipulation, misinformation, but I don't think it's the position or the views of the of the large part of the population in Venezuela.
Let's see, the next question. What help can a Venezuelan receive in countries like Peru or other countries, knowing the difficulty they have in their own country? In some cases, a xenophobic attitude, even from authorities. Human Rights Watch is aware of that. What help can you give them?
Well, we have been, actually, we have produced several reports about that issue. We have been advocating for TPS in the US, a temporary migration status for Venezuelans in the US. Unfortunately, without much success with the Trump administration. I have raised this issue at the very, very high level, but given the anti-immigrant position of the Trump administration from the top, they don't want to be inconsistent by looking, soft on Venezuelans, since their electoral base is happy rejecting the potential wave of immigrants coming from the rest of Latin America. So we have been advocating for better conditions and decent conditions for Venezuelans in most of the region. And for instance, by establishing some sort of common standards, same type of, not double standards, uniform standards with regard to access to education for the kids, access to health, access to not only jobs, but also a similar treatment in Argentina, Chile, Peru, etc. Regarding the diplomas, the way that in Latin America you treat the titles, if, for instance, let me give you a concrete example. If you are a dentist in Venezuela, or you are a nurse in Venezuela, and you have all your papers, what are the steps that you need to take for the Chileans or Peruvians to give you authorization to use your profession as a nurse, as a teacher, as a lawyer, to work in other countries. Unfortunately, we haven't made much progress. I would say that compared to the rest of the region, the country that has been probably the most open to Venezuelans is Colombia. It is incredible because Colombia has over 2 million Venezuelans. And they have been incredibly generous, including by making an interpretation of the Constitution to allow Venezuelans kid who has been actually born in Colombia, little babies born in Colombia, whose parents are Venezuelans. The government of Colombia made a special interpretation of the Constitution to grant citizenship for thousands of newborn Venezuelans in Colombia. I think the attitude of the Colombian government to welcome and to try to, with very limited resources, to support and protect those over 2 million Venezuelans is remarkable.
Can I jump here just for 1 second? I remember many years ago, there were 2 million Colombians living in Venezuela. And it was such an incredible experience, to see the Venezuelans and Colombians together. And now I guess that now are 2 million Venezuelans in Colombia. There has been Chileans, Argentinians in Venezuela also, and unfortunately Venezuelans have not received the same reaction as the Colombian government. I want to ask you something, because I think that is in the US, do you think that with the Biden government, the TPS has more chances to be approved than with this government?
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
Okay.
Absolutely, no question about it. Because
Why?
for one simple reason, the Trump administration, Trump himself, campaigned on an anti-immigrant slogan, rhetoric, using that one. That has been very, very strong from day number one of his campaign. And I'm not talking about his campaign for re-election. During the whole 4 years that he has been in charge, he has campaigned aggressively against the concept of immigrants, illegal immigrants, whatever, Mexicans, Central Americans, and he couldn't make an exception with Venezuelans. Venezuela obviously received special attention from the Trump administration. The Trump administration unilaterally did exercise a lot of pressure on the government of Maduro with sanctions to the oil, financial sanctions, as well as individual sanctions, and trying to promote isolation of the government of Venezuela. So when it comes to the conversation or discussion of the TPS for Venezuelans, naturally you were expecting some sort of consistency by supporting the Venezuelans who were, able to escape to the U.S., flying from, leaving a country for reasons of either persecution, humanitarian reasons, and so on and so forth. But unfortunately, the Trump administration was not receptive, because they have to keep a consistent anti-immigrant line, which is not the case of the Biden administration.
Okay, great. Thank you. I think that's very, even though, this rhetoric of that people that are here, they don't want a TPS. They just don't want socialism, which is other issue, no? But but it will be a fantastic change for Venezuelans. Sorry, Marcia. Go ahead.
It's a good question. I'm glad you asked it. So I'm just going to continue with the audience questions. And the next one is, what is your opinion about the opposition leadership? Leopoldo Lopez, Maria Corina Machado, Juan Guaido. What's your opinion is the question.
I have to be careful, not only because it's a difficult question, but also because my mandate, my job is to promote democracy, freedoms, to defend human rights, and so on and so forth. So I'm not in the business of making some political choices, among the political leaders of the Venezuelan opposition. Obviously, I'm fully aware that there are divisions and animosity among them. I wish that they could come to a common ground, common agenda. This is easy to say, but it's difficult in practical terms. With a strategic vision, long term, not short term, long term, and I have no doubt in my mind that all of them are interested in democracy, transition. They have fundamental differences in terms of the strategy to reach that change. But as long as they are divided and they try different tricks to highlight the lack of democracy in Venezuela, the need to make a transition. But as long as they are divided and choose different methods and make different choices, the only one that benefit is the dictatorship.
the next question is, in your opinion, what are the reasons that the Venezuelan refugee crisis is underfunded compared to, say, Syria or South Sudan?
The main reason is Maduro. Maduro is, I mean, there are a couple of reasons. Number one is, I think, Maduro. Maduro is, as we know, it was for a long time in denial. There was no shortages of food and medicine in Venezuela for many years. That was the official line. And then when the US started implementing and passing sanctions, especially oil sanctions, their line was, oh, those sanctions are responsible for this catastrophe, humanitarian, and then they acknowledged that one. There was no cause-effect relationship between the sanctions. If you look at the timing, you will see that the economy was devastated, in Venezuela, and the lack of, basic, support for especially the most vulnerable Venezuelans was present there, 2-3 years before, or actually 4 years before the sanctions, been aggravating conditions and so forth. So today, Maduro is willing to accept humanitarian support as long as he could put the seal of approval of the Bolivarian revolution. In other words, bring in medicines and food, but we, the government of Venezuela, Maduro, will distribute this, and with our name, because he wants to obviously profit politically to manipulate this one. And as a matter of policy, if there is a fundamental basic principle of the humanitarian community, of the international community involving humanitarian business, is that they cannot allow any government or any party to politicize this international. So there is an impasse there. Another factor is the lack of attention and lack of interest to Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations. He has been very much aloof and not engaged in the case of Venezuela. It's been very difficult to make sure that Guterres, the Secretary General, takes the Venezuelan case seriously. So without leadership from Guterres at the UN level, and with a government that is willing to accept support as long as it's under the seal of approval of the Bolivarian dictatorship, it really makes it impossible. Now there is some experimental project now with the support of the EU, the EU, and what we call the contact group and the EU, where for the first time, the government of Venezuela is willing to accept international aid under the sponsorship of the Pan American Health Organization, as well as the other humanitarian entities. But it's very limited, and it's a sort of pilot project. We will see how this is going to work.
I just going to ask you one more question because I think people like to know what they can do. And one of the questions that came in was, how can other human rights organizations work with you to create an even stronger force to sustain the pressure on the regime and create even greater world awareness of what's happening in Venezuela?
We are working on Venezuela 24/7. Venezuela is the biggest challenge that we have in the Western Hemisphere. Most of my hours in the day are on Venezuela, spent on Venezuela. We have, fortunately, a full-time researcher working on Venezuela as well, Tamara Tarasiuk. And we are constantly reporting on human rights conditions as well as the humanitarian crisis in Venezuela. And we work very closely with local groups, local organizations in Venezuela, as well as other international entities. I don't know what to tell you, what else is possible to do. But any effort that we could collectively try to, or to do by exposing conditions in Venezuela, to informing the world about a country that is, actually going through a really, really, really difficult time, and with no much hope for change, I think is welcome. We will continue reporting on Venezuela, and we will continue working and revealing and disclosing what exactly is happening there, and the abuses committed, and the need for the Biden administration to exercise effective pressure on Venezuela, as well as European governments. This week only, we are having two very important meetings with government officials at pretty high level in Europe, discussing the case of Venezuela. There are countries, for instance, where Venezuela is not getting enough attention. One of them in Europe is Italy. For some, it's very hard to explain, because the Italian Venezuelan community is very, very large. It's not just Portuguese and Spanish, Italians as well. They have a large community in Venezuela. And unfortunately, the Italian government has not been very open, receptive, and supportive of conditions in Venezuela. So that's why we are developing, trying to open contacts. We will be, I already testified before the House of Congress, and next week we will be testifying before the Senate in Italy, explaining, with different political parties, what exactly is happening in Venezuela. But it's a hard process that requires consistent and firm attention. Without international pressure, I don't see much chance for change in Venezuela.
It's 6 o'clock, just a tiny bit after, so I'm gonna end things. I want to thank you so much, José Miguel, for talking with me about this, and Ana Julia for inviting me to come to speak. I also want to thank the association team for making this event possible: Lina Delgado, Linda Calvet, and Ivan Perea. We have more in the works, more exciting programs, and we'll send you invitations once we have details confirmed. If you're not already a member of the Venezuelan American Association and you're interested in joining, please contact the team via the invitation that you received. Thank you all for participating, and I look forward, and everyone looks forward to seeing each other again soon in person. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for having me. Thanks a lot, really.